Okay. Thank you, Albert. Thank you, Martin. Good morning from Guatemala, good afternoon in the United States, and good evening in Europe. My name is Marco Gonzalez. I am the director of Yahad Inunum, and I am honored and I am glad to open this first lectures on our Beyond Memory program. And it is an honor for me also to have as our guest speaker today, Martin Dean, who is not only a big researcher, but it's someone who knows the work of our organization, Yahad Inunum, and it's also a friend for so many years. So thank you very much for being present, for saying present to this invitation. I am here in Guatemala at the Holocaust Museum that was opened by Yahad Inunum, and I am with Angel Del Valle, who is the director of the museum, and I am with Maria Jose, who is in charge of the educational programs, and with Freddie, who is also working with us at the museum. And we have a special topic, I will say, because we just are commemorating the 80 years of the Babyn Yar massacre, and it is important that we don't forget, but also that we understand what happened there, and how this became a model for modern and contemporary genocides and mass crimes. So thank you very much for being with us today.
So, and yeah, also from my side, hello to all. First, I'm very honored that so many people came to our conference today. We, Yahad Inunum, are very glad to be continuing our Beyond Memory conference series again this year. And with this year's conference series, we would like to focus especially on the events of 1941. This includes the 80th anniversary of the massacre of 33,771 murdered Jews at Babyn Yar in Ukraine. And for our conference today, we have invited Martin Dean. Martin Dean received his PhD in European history from Queen's College, Cambridge. Dean conducted research in the KGB archives in the former Soviet Union and prepared the historical documentation for several war crime prosecutions. As a researcher, scholar at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, he was a volume editor for the Encyclopedia of Camps and Ghettos. His publications include Collaboration in the Holocaust, published in 2000, and Robbing the Jews, published in 2008, which won a National Jewish Book Award in 2009. He is based in Washington, D.C. and works as a historical researcher for the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center and as an adjunct professor teaching courses on the Holocaust studies and World War II at Kean University, New Jersey. His ongoing research project is an analysis of the Babyn Yar massacre, combining aerial photography, ground photographs, and witness testimony. We will hear more about this now. So Martin Dean, the stage is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Marco and Albert. And it's a great privilege to be here. And my thanks go especially a big merci beaucoup to Patrick Dubois and Yahad Inunum for inviting me today on this tragic but special day. Today, I will examine the complex history of Babyn Yar. It serves as the most powerful symbol of the Holocaust by bullets, the Nazi mass shootings of Jews on occupied Soviet territory. But even today, many details of what happened there are still shrouded in mystery. Which to resolve some of these unknowns, that I engaged in a large-scale research project for the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center 2 years ago. Essentially, this mass shooting took place soon after Himmler ordered the Nazi security police to expand their target of their operations to include Jewish women and children. And it encompassed the destruction of the Jewish population of an entire city over the course of just 2 days on September the 29th to 30th, 1941. So that's exactly 80 years ago today. Using photographs, witness testimonies, and aerial images, I will reconstruct the route taken by the Jews into the ravine and identify the location of the mass shootings. by following the discarded property and clothing of the Jews captured in contemporary photographs. This leads us like a trail of breadcrumbs to the site where the massacre took place. We will also examine the responses of individual Jews along the route and the measures taken by the Germans to confiscate Jewish property. Finally, we will examine German efforts to conceal and destroy the mass graves, as well as the post-war Soviet denial of the Jewish identity of the majority of the victims at Babyn Yar. The Einsatzgruppen were the SS and police squads that followed the army into the Soviet Union to deal with what they determined were declared enemies. These squads kept detailed records of their mass shootings that added up to more than 1 million victims in total by mid-1942. The reports give the place, date, and number of victims for their shooting operations. Those shot are described mostly as Jews. Einsatzgruppen report number 106 states that 33,771 Jews were shot at Babyn Yar on September the 29th to the 30th, 1941. By August 1941, mass shootings were an almost daily occurrence for members of the Einsatzgruppen. Here you see the method used in June and July of 1941 for smaller mass shootings. These resembled more the procedures of a shooting squad or a firing squad. Mobile Einsatzgruppen were specially designed teams of about 3,000 men, consisting of security police officers and guards supplied by the Waffen-SS and Order Police, and many police drivers who also participated in the shootings. In addition, there were translators and other support staff, some of whom were recruited locally. The Einsatzgruppen were supported also by police battalions, local auxiliaries, and the Wehrmacht. From the start, the Einsatzgruppen targeted the Jewish intelligentsia, but increasingly also Jewish men of military age between 18 and 45 years old. From mid-August 1941, one Einsatzgruppe after another started to expand the killings to include women and children. By September 41, complete Jewish communities were to be exterminated in newly occupied towns and cities. The German security police used deception to encourage the Jews to report and to facilitate their murderous plans. So following the mass shootings in Kamenets-Podolsky, here in the southwest, where about 23,000 Jews were killed at the end of August 1941, there were also mass shootings conducted in September in Zhytomyr, Berdychev, and Vinnytsia as the Germans approached Kiev. And then finally also in Radomyshil and here in Bielitserkva. Then on September 19th, the German army entered Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, after a prolonged battle in which the city became encircled. The battle north of Kiev brought some time for the Soviets to evacuate industrial workers, some industry and government officials out of the city. Among them were large numbers of Jews. Probably more than 100,000 Jews managed to evacuate, leaving some 50,000 or so behind. The evacuation of industry by the Soviets was a major accomplishment, which enabled them to rescue key production further east. Jews were not given priority in the evacuations, but many of them were saved from Kiev nonetheless. But the conditions for the evacuees were still very harsh. For example, Fira Schwartz, her father, as a railroad employee, was evacuated with his family at the beginning of July 1941. They could only take very little luggage. Fira recalled, "We only took the most necessary clothing, my toys and children's books, my bed linen, and a few pots." They were evacuated to Magnitogorsk, but soon her father was called up to the Red Army and was killed at the front. As she recalls, "My mother and I were starving and freezing because we didn't have any winter clothes. In early 1943, Fira's mother died of pneumonia. Her grandfather remained behind in Kiev and was killed at Babyn Yar. By the end of the war, Fira had become an orphan." Some Jews, such as Sarah Schulman, were sent soon after the German approach or the German invasion to dig trenches in the vicinity of Kiev for several weeks. As she explained, "I was a Soviet person, they told us to go, and so we went." On her return, her parents had already been evacuated. Then she fled from Kiev just in time and served with a nursing unit near the front. Later, she was evacuated to Central Asia. "We went on a freight train. Our trip lasted for over a month until we arrived in Uzbekistan, 3,000 kilometers from Kiev. We rented a hut from an Uzbek man who allowed us to pick tomatoes from his garden. The local population was friendly, and we didn't face any anti-Semitism. On returning to Kiev in 1944, she found that her grandparents had been killed at Babyn Yar. So the German forces arrived in Kiev on around September 19th, 1941, and on September 24th, several large explosions wrecked buildings used by the German military administration along Kiev's main street, the Khreshchatyk. They were caused by mines set off by the Soviet security service, killing dozens of people. The resulting fires burned for a week, together with German containment measures, causing widespread damage in the city. Thousands of people were made homeless. On September 25th to 27th, the SS and the Wehrmacht commanders in the city held meetings. They decided to murder the city's Jews as a reprisal for the recent explosions. Placards calling on all Jews to present themselves at a specific road junction near Babyn Yar were posted around the city by the Ukrainian police on September 28th. The threatened punishment for not complying was death. So the Jews speculated as to what this could all mean. Some feared the worst, but most expected that there would be some form of resettlement. Jewish teenager Vera Bogutska, for example, noted, "Most people were of the opinion that we would be sent away to work. My mother packed up our things. I saw that the streets were full of people carrying luggage. Some of them had carts. They were all going in one direction. Towards evening, my mother and I left our apartment with our luggage. We went down several streets with many other people. The collection point was near the Jewish burial grounds." In response to the placards, more than 20,000 Jews took to the streets of Kiev on September 29th. This photograph taken by a German in Kiev on that day is inscribed on the back, "Jews taking their last journey on earth." Even at Babyn Yar, it is important to think of the Holocaust as a complex process comprised of several stages. Rael Hilberg has described the four main stages as definition, concentration, confiscation, and destruction. As we see, the events at Babyn Yar also followed the same pattern, only the events and processes that were spread over some 10 years in Germany were compressed into just 2 days at Babyn Yar. Here we see a 3D model reconstruction of the first checkpoint created by Max Rokmaniko and his Spatial Tech 3D team in Kiev, using available data about the local terrain. The checkpoint is described vividly by Jewish survivor Genya Batasheva and other witnesses. It was the place where non-Jews accompanying friends and relatives had to turn back, vehicles could go no further, and the Jews had to continue on foot with only what they could carry. From here on, the Jews were more closely guarded, and there was little chance of escape. Rebecca Schwarzman and her family were accompanied to the checkpoint by a non-Jewish neighbor and her 2 daughters. The Germans were armed with machine guns, and some were on motorbikes. One of the non-Jewish women was carrying Rebecca's 1-year-old son as they reached the checkpoint. As the fair-haired baby boy was being returned to Rebecca, the German guard asked if she was Jewish. "Yes," she said, but the guard insisted, "The pretty blonde boy must go back." He then indicated to Rebecca and her sister they should flee. Rebecca extracted herself from the crowd with the boy and made her way to one of the cemeteries, where she hid in a crypt for the rest of the day, breastfeeding her son to keep him quiet. Now I have the testimony of Leonard Pushta, the driver for Sonderkommando 4A, who recalled, "I drove out of Kiev and came to an alley. There was a checkpoint which let me through. I saw that along this alley, Jews were marching. They were going in groups as if for a stroll. On the left lay an enormous pile of luggage, which was about 3 meters by 2 meters. It looked like a huge pile of potatoes. The Jews threw their luggage onto this pile. At the end of the alley on the right, there was an open area where the registration took place." So at the end of the alley of trees, the Jews were forced to surrender their documents and then were formed into groups for the next stage of the journey. Some were transported on by truck, and others marched on foot through a brutal narrow corridor of guards and into the so-called sand quarry. This is a view of the alley of trees seen from above. I've taken from a photograph in 1943. And the likely registration point would be here at the end of the alley on the right. There's a slight slope going upwards. And just a bit further on, you get to the entrance of Babyn Yar, or it's sort of the shallow end of the main ravine. So the question is often asked why the Jews didn't do more to resist. In approaching this question, it is important to stress that the vast majority of Jews who took to the streets on September 29th to 30th, 1941 in Kiev were women, children, and the elderly, as almost all men of military age had already been conscripted or evacuated. As one eyewitness recalled, there were women, elderly people, and children. The adults were all at war. Then there was the high level of deception practiced by the Germans, which carefully concealed the real aim of the order for the Jews to assemble. Many Jews thought that they would be transported via the freight railway station close to the cemeteries. As a result, most Jews came to realize their fate only too late, when they began to hear the shots. By then, they were already within the tight police cordon that offered almost no chance of escape. Nonetheless, there were a few quite miraculous escapes. For example, Reuven Stein, who was a teenager at the time, recalls, "From the first steps of our journey, I began to look for a possibility to escape from the column. But how and in what manner? The column was escorted by armed Nazis, and when there was only 250 or so meters remaining to Babyn Yar, I jumped unnoticed out of the column into the ditch alongside the road and crawled into a drainage canal that ran under the street. I sat there until it became dark. Later, I climbed out on the other side of the street and went through the old cemetery to the edge of the city. Then in the night, I made my way home." So this is the route taken by the Jews out of the city, which is fairly well known. Initially, they were marched down Melnikov Street, which comes out of the city right here. Around here is the first checkpoint, opposite to Pugachev Street. And then they came up past the beginnings of the Jewish cemetery here and turned left down what's called Kahatna Street. And then here's the Alley of Trees, which is also known as Dorogozhitska Street, which leads to the start of Babyn Yar around here. I think the ones taken by vehicle would probably continue on this road and were led around here to enter the sand quarry this way. What's not so clear is how the Jews who went by foot, but it seems most likely they probably went up this part of the main ravine and then came out of it, probably around here, and then entered the sand quarry, where we have evidence that the Jews were forced to undress. But there is some witness testimony that might help us with this question, as there's not much testimony, but one or two testimonies do seem to indicate that they may have gone down the main ravine. Here's the story of Yevgeny Yegel. From Melnikov Street, the flow of citizens headed left towards Dorogozhitska Street, and then along this street towards the end of the Lukyanovsky and the military cemeteries, and then to the right along the natural boundary of Babyn Yar. At this point, the Nazis stood in two rows tightly next to each other and created a living corridor, along which they drove the people doomed to death in a continuous stream. In this area, I stayed with my father. Now, I do not remember exactly where, but at one point there were small ravines, and here the guards were standing farther apart. Seeing this, my father pushed me into one of the ravines and he followed me. We went out of the ravine to the cemetery, where we waited until late at night and then left for my father's house. So it's possible he's talking about one of these side ravines here coming off the route, but it is difficult to tell the exact path they took, but it becomes clearer here with regard to the sand quarry that you can see on this photograph. So the main clues we have about the route of the Jews are this series of photographs taken shortly after the massacre by the German propaganda photographer Johannes Hailer. They've become quite iconic. And for a long time, we didn't know where they were taken. I was deceived because of what appears to be the height of the cliffs here. And I couldn't imagine where this would be. But then I looked at the man standing here on the top, and it gives you some idea of the scale of the cliffs. And it's more like 20 meters rather than sort of 80 meters. So I was then able to locate correctly using actually some maps drawn in the 1950s where the sand quarry was. So the Hailer photographs show vast piles of clothing in what looks like a sand quarry, and also Soviet POWs covering over the ground in a long, steep sided ravine. But where were these photographs taken? This was the difficult research goal that the BHYMC historical team was set at that time under Karol Berkoff's leadership in 2019. quickly identify the shooting ravine with the POWs, we used the lone tree on the skyline as a reference point. Here you can see it in post-war images. You look down the main ravine and you see the tree clearly silhouetted against the skyline. But here in the halo photograph, you can't really see the tree unless you blow up the image, and then you can see it against the skyline here. So this is the halo image with the tree against the skyline. Obviously, it must be from a different angle than the other photographs which have it against the sky. It's not just that the person has to be lower down, but it's clearly a different angle with quite different background. So this gave us the idea that there were actually two separate ravines, and the main ravine, or the ravine where most of the shooting took place, was not the main ravine going north-south, but this southwestern spur that goes out towards the Sirets camp. And here you see the different angles on the lone tree. This is looking down the main ravine, and this is looking down the western spur where the tree is concealed by the trees behind it. You literally can't see the tree for the woods behind it. But you do see the same, it's obviously the same ridge, so that they're not very far away, but they're just at different angles. So by using aerial photography, we were able to pinpoint also where Halo was standing on the road at the end of the western spur. So standing on this road here looking down, which is close to where the Sirets camp was later built in 1942. By enlarging the aerial photo, we're also able to identify the sand quarry, which you see here in between the main ravine and the western spur. And this is where the Jews were forced to undress. And its location had been very difficult to ascertain before, because it's missing from almost all the maps of the area. Both the maps before 1930, including the 1924 topographical survey, which was used to create the main 3D model of Babyn Yar, but also after about 1950, there's a road built over this area, and so you can't see it after the war either. And so the shifting sands of Babyn Yar really served to sow confusion for historians for many years, and that was quite a difficult puzzle to solve. So by sort of extrapolating from the Halo photographs, again, the Spatial Tech 3D image team were able to show that the clothing actually goes round in this pile to the left, which probably indicates the route taken to the Jews by the Jews. And once they were forced to undress, most likely they climbed up this slope at one of the less steep parts and then entered the shooting ravine, which is along here, via a notch. There were either one or two notches cut in the top here to allow them to enter the ravine. And then most of the shootings took place probably along the whole length of this western ravine. The precise extent is hard to determine. So here we see a reconstructed view. So this is just someone's imagination of what it would look like, but it's based in part on the 3D model. And the Jews were driven into the left-hand corner of the sand quarry to enter the western spur up a slope here, and then through a specially created passageway called the Notch. Albin Pover, who was a German policeman present in the sand quarry, gave the following description. In the ensuing hollow, there were throngs of assembled Jews. The Jews had to undress at the end of the sand quarry, went partly naked, partly in their underclothes, over a steep slope, and disappeared into the adjacent valley or behind a mountain slope. From there, one could hear shooting. So this is a map showing the likely location of the mass shootings in the Western Spur. As many as 3 or 4 separate shooting squads were operating along its entire length and in this branch of the ravine. It's possible there was some shooting right up here at the junction, maybe even in this area, but it's very hard to tell from the available descriptions because it wasn't possible for people to look into this area. We do know that the people observed what was going in this part of the ravine and described the shooting taking place there. So Halo was standing here at the end of this western spur, looking down the length of the shooting ravine when he took his iconic photograph, which shows the POWs covering the ground. We'll look at this photo again. And if you look closely here at the image, you'll see there, you can just see the top of the sand quarry here, just as you go towards the junction with the main ravine. Here again, you see this prominent spur, and here's the lone tree. And as Trill describes, when he's standing on this position, the ravine itself moves around to the right. Now, interesting about this photograph is the sides of the ravine here look to be quite steep and as if they've been sort of uncovered recently. what we believe, and there's at least one fairly reliable witness testimony that confirms it, and a lot of hearsay evidence about the same thing. Once the ravine was full of corpses, what the Germans did to cover them and bury them was to blow up the sides of the ravine, making them steeper, and as much as 3 meters or so of sand was then thrown sort of inwards towards the central ravine, burying all the corpses. But even so, they still brought in the Soviet POWs to sort of flatten it and smooth it out. Afterwards, they even tried to put in some bushes and things to cover it over. So even in 1941, there was a big effort by the Germans to cover over the dirty work. And then they came back in 1943 and actually exhumed the corpses and burned them in a further attempt to remove the traces. This is the description given by German driver Victor Trill, looking from the bridge, so here on the road. The depression made a turn to the right, where behind this curve, a large round depression in the ground was located. It's possible that this comprised a former sand or gravel pit. In this pit, there were also countless people who I can safely assume were all Jews. Also in this pit were mountains of clothing of all sorts. So this is just an indication of how the Jews most likely entered the shooting ravine. They certainly came in through this notch that was about halfway down the ravine. It's possible that some also went down into the main ravine and then up into the entrance this way. Obviously, they would have to be separated in different groups for the shooting squads not to shoot each other. So it's possible that some may even have come along this side and down further on, or they would have sort of marched past the shooting squads to other places. Gradually, the whole of this ravine was sort of filled up with corpses as the 2 days went on, and that's described by Trill and others as well. So we do have Jewish survivor testimonies. Of course, they didn't have such a clear view of what was going on. Dina Promenicheva, an important witness, she was shot just as it was sort of gathering darkness, and her testimony is very powerful. I'll read it to you. It's maybe a little, gives a slightly impression of only part of the shooting, because over the series of 2 days, the method of shooting did change at least 2 or 3 times, but it's still a very important testimony. She says, in the evening, a German officer arrived and said that we should all be shot. So she told them that she was not Jewish, although she did have at least one Jewish parent, but she was put with other non-Jews who were told to wait at the side of the sand quarry. But then in the evening, the officer says that they should all be shot. As if even one person got away from here, they would talk. And then the next day, not a single Jew would appear. So Promenicheva continues in her testimony. We were all led to be shot at the sandy notch, but we were not forced to undress because it was growing dark and the Germans were tired. Coming out of the so-called door from this notch, to the left, there was a small ledge where all the people formed up and were executed from the opposite side with machine guns. People fell into a very, very deep abyss. I shut my eyes, squeezed my fists, and threw myself down before a shot came. Of course, it seemed to me that I was flying a whole eternity because I was very high up. I felt neither pain while I was falling, nor the impact, nothing. My only wish was to live. So subsequently, Promenicheva crawled out from under the pile of bodies and managed to survive. And there were several other survivors, mostly people who were shot towards the end of the first day, and in a similar way were able to sort of throw themselves into the cliff before they were shot. It seems there was only at that time that they used this rather impractical method of firing from a distance, maybe even from the opposite side with machine guns. Most of the shooting was done at close range with machine pistols, usually from behind, and they would force the Jews to lay on top of each other, sort of pile up, or just kneeling down on the ground. So the method did vary over time, and I think this method of sort of shooting from a greater distance was only used in the evening. Another German describes shooting them from behind on the edge of the ravine, again because they didn't want at that stage to go down into the ravine because it was already full of bodies. So the mechanism probably became less efficient as the shooting went on, and it was difficult to get into the ravine at all. Just want to show you some other evidence I have about the Babyn Yar events. This original document sent by Sonderkommando 4A from Kiev lists hundreds of items of jewelry that were collected from Jews as they took their last steps into the Babyn Yar ravine. The list includes 63 ladies' watches and more than 300 rings, and 95 decorative chains weighing in total more than 2.5 kilograms. This was likely only a fraction of the total collected there, as several different SS units and police units were involved in the massacre. This was one of dozens of reports I found in the archives of the War Booty Office in Berlin, where they were open to the public only after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. So in this photo, we see members of the SS searching the discarded clothing at Babyn Yar for any hidden valuables. According to the police testimonies, initially they were searching people on the way, but this slowed things up so much that the decision was made just to make everybody take off their clothes so that the clothing could be searched for valuables after the shooting had taken place, because it was slowing down procedure so much. There were so many people coming. Subsequently, the clothing was also transported away in trucks and stored in warehouses for distribution to needy ethnic Germans or for sale to the local population. Of course, there was also private theft on a massive scale that accompanied the official looting. Some police battalion members talk about counting ruble notes for days after this, although at that time they thought that the rubles would be worthless, although later on some of them were used when they occupied Kharkov, where the ruble was still in operation. And here we see one of Haler's photographs. It's a close-up of discarded clothing in Babyn Yar. We see even a picture of a loved one, or maybe even the victim themselves here, and it just shows how traumatic the whole events must have been. I'll just leave this with you for a moment. This was taken literally the day after the shooting, and then there are several close-up photos like this. And it's clearly taken in the sand quarry. So the furniture left behind in Jewish apartments in Kiev was also officially confiscated by the German occupation authorities. This meant that non-Jews who moved into the apartments in late 1941 also had to register any property they left behind. They were then given the option of either purchasing it or handing it over to the German authorities. In this document, a local inhabitant agrees to purchase former Jewish furniture and to pay for it in 6 monthly installments. Among the items purchased are one dining table, one bookcase, one small table, a bed with a mattress. There was also a buffet, a child's bed, and a sofa. So there were a lot of other mass shootings in and around Babyn Yar in the months and even years after September 1941. In October, there were quite a few, obviously, shootings of Jews uncovered in the city, and also some punitive shootings of non-Jewish inhabitants as a kind of reprisal again for any sabotage in the city. Later on, you get shootings of Roma and also of partisans. Even some Ukrainian nationalists are shot in or near Babyn Yar. So the site becomes literally littered with 10 or more different mass graves. And in 1942, the Germans set up a concentration camp, or a so-called work education camp at Sirets, very close to Babyn Yar. So it was convenient for them, because often prisoners who wanted to be punished would be taken into Babyn Yar and shot there, although there are a number of graves on the site of the Sirets camp as well were discovered after the war. These are the dugouts inside the camp. And then as the occupation was coming to an end, and this has been researched very thoroughly recently by Andrew Angerick, there was a special operation 1005, which was led by Paul Blobel, the same man who actually organized the original killings at Babyn Yar. He was then tasked with trying to erase the traces of German mass graves throughout the occupied East. And one of the first places he started with this was at Babyn Yar outside of Kiev, because he knew the local terrain. So the history of the Sirets camp is kind of intertwined with Babyn Yar in various ways. The prisoners there were witnesses to some of the subsequent shootings that were taking place just outside their camp at the end of the southwestern spur of the ravine. And then in August of 1943, around 100 prisoners were taken from Sirets to the actual sand quarry, and a sub-camp of Sirets was opened there for the exhumation of the mass graves in and around Babyn Yar, again under the guidance of Blobel. They were not guarded by any Ukrainians while they were there. They only had German order police and SS staff supervising them, and it was really quite a horrendous operation. And this photograph from 1943, remarkably, it shows that there were two dugouts or sort of bunkers or barracks that had been buried in the sand. Here you see them with sort of the curve of the roof. So these were similar to the ones in the Sirets camp, but they'd sort of literally been half buried by sand. So they were difficult to see from the outside. You can see maybe there's a dark spot here, which shows how there were some steps going into the entrance. Each barrack held this one held more than 100 people. This one probably held about 80 people. At the very end, there were as many as 300 prisoners there because there was so much work to be done. They brought more prisoners in. And in my view, this is also the shadow of a guard tower, which is described both by prisoners and some of the guards when they testified after the war. And we only know about the details of this whole operation because about 15 of the prisoners escaped successfully just before the rest of the prison details were shot. So once they'd finished burning the corpses here, and that was a huge operation that took about 6 weeks, they used the tombstones from the Jewish cemetery to form the basis for large funeral pyres, on which they then piled up corpses together with logs and covered them in oil and burnt them. Description is of many as 60,000 people or so being burned in these funeral pyres. And at the end of that operation, the prisoners got a tip off from one of the guards that they would probably be shot the next day. So there was a mass escape. The way they managed to escape was also quite incredible. They had actually been searching the corpses that had been exhumed again for any valuables hidden on their person. The gold teeth were being ripped out by a special brigade of the prisoners. And some of the prisoners had the smart idea of looking for any keys that might be in the pockets of those Jews that were not completely undressed. And surprisingly, they found a key that matched the entrance to one of the bunkers. So that enabled, at least from one of the bunker, the prisoners to escape. And the German guards were surprised in the middle of the night, and as I say, about 15 managed to escape. So here's a picture of Yakov Karpa, one of the 15 successfully escaped prisoners. And he testified on several occasions about his work exhuming the graves there, and also the successful escape and his other experiences during the war. After the war, another one of the escapees here is pointing to the western spur from slightly further along on the left-hand side than where Haley was standing. You can see again the cliff in the distance. And this is what it looked like in 1944, 1945. And it's very similar to what Haley was showing. So further evidence, this is where most of the exhumations probably took place. Although, as I mentioned, there were as many as 10 other sites around the edges of the ravine mostly, or even further down near the psychiatric hospital where some patients were also murdered in or near the ravine. And most of these sites were exhumed by the prisoners in the period up to September 1943. I'll only mention very briefly the post-war history of Babyn Yar. Obviously, the Soviets were not keen to have it as a kind of gathering place for Jews after the war and were reluctant to put up any memorial there. Yevtushenko wrote his famous poem in 1961, having visited Babyn Yar together with Anatoly Kuznetsov in August 1961. And the opening line is, "No monument stands over Babyn Yar," which was an indictment of the Soviet suppression of information about the Holocaust. The poem became a rallying cry for Jews and other writers. You also get Shostakovich writing a symphony about it, and Jews and other protesters would gather regularly at Babyn Yar for commemorations in the following years, despite strong discouragement by the Soviet authorities, and on some occasions people were arrested just for gathering at Babyn Yar. Eventually a Soviet memorial was completed in 1976, but its inscription referred to the victims only as peaceful Soviet citizens, continuing the Soviet policy of concealing the Holocaust, which still carried on into the 1980s. Only once Ukraine was independent did you get more appropriate memorials put up. This is the one which I visited in 2017. It had been put up some years earlier as a memorial to the Jewish victims at Babyn Yar. Now a number of additional sites are being added by the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center, and the plan is to put up a large exhibition and museum and center for people to gather so that you have an appropriate memorial at Babyn Yar after so many years. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm ready to take any questions that Albert may want to throw my way. Albert, you? Oh.
Yeah. Are there any questions to Martin Dean? I'm sure. Yeah. You are, after this presentation, quite curious maybe to ask some questions. So maybe just yeah, give a sign with the Zoom app, and so then I can choose and you can start asking your question.
Shall I take the first question, Albert? It's about Ukrainian involvement.
Okay. Yeah, please go.
So in some respects, Babyn Yar was a little bit untypical because it happened so soon after the Germans arrived in Kiev. So they literally arrived on the 19th of September, and already on the 28th, they put up the posters calling the Jews to arrive. So there wasn't much time to really organize a local Ukrainian police force. There were some policemen mainly who'd come from the western part of Ukraine, and they did participate. But as far as I can tell from the evidence I've seen, which of course is mainly German sources, most of the actual shooting, if not all of the shooting, was done by Germans. But there were Ukrainian policemen present as guards around the site. They probably formed a part of the corridor, forcing Jews to go quickly towards the undressing place. And some Jewish testimonies also describe Ukrainians as sort of being the ones who forced them to undress quickly, were beating them at that time. So there was Ukrainian participation. Definitely, you also hear stories about Ukrainians either denouncing Jews or taking Jews, handing them over to the Germans during this period. And also at the a place where the carts had to turn back, the first checkpoint, some local members of the local population, they may have been Russian, they may have been Ukrainian, were also already helping themselves to items of property there. So there is a post-war history of anti-Semitism in Kiev. When the Jews come back after the war, there was quite a bit during the 20s and 30s, and even at this time, some anti-Semitism in Kiev, although the more virulent anti-Semitism was probably with the Ukrainian nationalists who often came to this region with the Germans from the West and then organized the local police forces. But there was a problem of denunciation, particularly in Kiev, although a reasonable amount of intermarriage meant that there were also some supportive voices, both when the Jews were rounded up and a few people did manage to hide with friends they had in Kiev or even relatives. And it was difficult for half Jews. They had to decide whether to go or not. It wasn't really clear from the information. They think some were instructed to go along, but they realized it wasn't a good idea by the time they checked out with the local authorities. And so while there was a lot of collaboration with the Germans, it would be wrong to typify that as the overall mood of the population. It's quite complicated in this period.
Another question from Marta Goldman from Budapest. Could you give us more details about the evacuation of the Jews from Kiev by the Soviets before the Germans arrived?
Right, so there was no specific policy to evacuate Jews, and this may be a mistake because to some extent the Soviet authorities were gradually becoming aware of the targeting of Jews, but it was really governed by war necessity. So the main aim was to evacuate factories that could still be useful and deny them to the Germans, or at least sabotage those factories they couldn't evacuate. And it was an amazing job how they did evacuate factories, not only from Kiev, but from many other cities. And that meant the workers in those factories were already also evacuated. And that sometimes meant that their families could also go with them, although that was less organized. Sometimes the workers themselves organized that, but they tried to do everything they could to get their families out. So a lot of Jews worked in factories or were government officials. Also government officials were given priority. So for that reason, many of the Jews were evacuated from Kiev, but there were at least 40 or 50,000 that were left behind. And it was mainly the elderly, women and children who didn't get the priority for being either in the Red Army or evacuated or working as nurses, something like that. So even some of the younger women had a better chance to be evacuated than say the elderly or the children. So you do get this group of people who go to Babyn Yar who are the ones least able to sort of escape or protect themselves, unfortunately.
Okay, I think I have two quite more questions to the memorial of our days. So one is, wait, just a moment. Genau. What else is there now in that ravine? And maybe also, maybe starting with this question, yeah. What can we find today in the ravine of Babyn Yar?
Well, this is the problem I was faced with as a historian trying to reconstruct the events, that the terrain where it took place looks completely different today. There is no ravine really where it took place. It was kind of leveled, and a road was built through there and a park. So it looks like any other part of the city, and the very characteristic features of the ravine where the shooting took place and the sand quarry and even the main ravine are very hard to discern, at least where the places where the shooting took place. So there is a park, there are memorials, there's also information plates, open air ones that you can find out about the shooting, and they are more or less in the right place. They're close both to the sand quarry and the shooting ravine. If you transpose the original sort of 1940 map over the present day map, but it is problematic in the sense that you can't really identify the landscape that you would see in the photograph. So what they have done recently, which is quite an interesting idea, also was one of Carol Berkoff's suggestions, was to put in some literally viewing points where you can look through something like a binocular and you see the Hailer photograph in exactly the place where Hailer was standing for several of his photographs. So this is to try and give people some idea what it looked like at the time. And then the other idea we've had, and we'll go ahead with, is the 3D model that will give people a chance to sort of walk around and see various scenes of what happened in 1941 and get much more familiar with the terrain that way. At the same time, we want to make the current park a place where people can pay proper homage to the victims and to feel comfortable. And so there are a number of different either artworks or memorials. There's also a synagogue being put in there. And these plans are obviously being discussed very closely with the government authorities, getting public opinion on it. And I'm not completely informed on that. So we will learn more about the most current plans when we go to Kiev next week for the official formal commemoration with the president of Ukraine and the leaders of the Babyn Yar Holocaust Memorial Center.
Ben Boris wants to know, how ready are the authorities to accept what really took place in Babyn Yar? So now we have the memorial. Tell us maybe more about this, Martin.
I think with Ukraine, you always have to distinguish between different groups. And currently the government authorities are fairly amenable to an honest and fair representation, but that may change with political winds. Unfortunately, in Eastern Europe, it's not unusual for history to be politicized. I deplore that development, but Putin is the prime example of someone who loves to politicize history, so the Ukrainians are always on their back foot against him. And things can change in the future, so we have to be aware of that. But currently, I think it's an honest and very worthwhile attempt to give a fair description of the events. I was reading a more detailed narrative of the events of Babyn Yar put together by my Ukrainian colleagues today, and they're not hiding anything at all. They're being fully accurate and detailed about the participation of Ukrainians at Babyn Yar and at other places as far as they can document it, and I applaud that effort. So the historians are definitely doing a good job, but of course politics can change, and so we have to be aware of that and still fight for the truth as much as we can against whatever pressures we face.
Okay. Telly Nates wants to know, as killings happened before the ones in Kiev, did the Jews of Kiev hear any rumors about this?
That's a very good question. And again, it's a complicated one to answer. So there were some refugees who came from further west, including some who had escaped from Poland in 1939, who did warn people. There were, of course, other reasons why people were not so suspicious of the Germans. One was the experience in World War I, where at times German soldiers occupied much of Ukraine, and including after the war, parts of Kiev were under German influence at least. And so the experience from World War I was that the Germans were quite reasonable towards the local population. And then also the Soviet authorities, because of the Nazi-Soviet pact, they kind of suppressed information about German atrocities, specifically against Jews in the period 1939 to 41. So there wasn't so much to be read in the official Soviet press, and there wasn't many other access to information. So those two reasons sort of counted against it. And then I perhaps alluded to this a bit before, that the Soviet Jews were used to obeying government instructions. So this meant that when they were ordered to appear in September 1941, as many as 80% of the people may have just simply obeyed those orders, which was obviously a big mistake people were speculating what would happen to them, but they also couldn't imagine that in 1 or 2 days that the entire Jewish population could be shot. So until you start hearing the shots, it might happen, but you're not really expecting it. And there seemed to be a few other alternatives from that. So the Germans did go into the houses and pull people out on the streets. It's not that everybody went completely voluntarily, but there were a few options. Even those who tried to hide for a few days, most of them were found or denounced in the days and weeks afterwards. So it's complicated. There was some information, but only a small proportion of people really had the sort of fear of the authorities to go and hide at that time. And it was really a problem where to hide, what to do. There weren't too many options. So many people suspected something bad might happen, didn't really see any other options.
So maybe one last question. Barbara wants to know, what about Holodomor? Many of the older Jews clearly had been through the famine. Were they too scared not to obey authorities given prior experience?
So certainly, so many of the older Jews had experienced the Holodomor, and that may have had different impacts on them. I think it was more the Sovietization of them probably made them perhaps more passive than maybe Jews in some other regions who had more independent traditions. So the Jewish organizations had been more or less smashed by the Soviets in the late 20s and early 1930s. Even things like a separate Jewish press was sort of harder to maintain. So only the ones who wrote Yiddish stories that followed the Soviet line were sort of allowed to carry on publishing. So there was no real Jewish leadership to sort of organize some kind of counter resistance to this. So I think the Holodomor was one experience, but especially the different impacts of various Soviet changes. So for a long time, the Jews were actually quite pleased with the Soviet Union, which gave them opportunities they didn't have under the Tsarist regime. The new professions were open to them, but gradually, as the 30s went on, you see even the Jews from the Communist Party get subjected to purges, and the Communist Party itself becomes much more Russified, and the Jewish role in that is much less. So that was another thing that was going on in the Soviet Union just before the German invasion.
And maybe one question from Stuart Bogum. Are there lists of victims available?
Right, that's a very good question. There's not the kind of list you get for Germany or for France, where everyone who was put on a train, because they had property, they were registered and counted, and the lists were kept. So the only lists we have are really from memorial books, originally at least. These were composed mostly in the period after the war, especially in the sort of 80s and 90s, as Kiev was becoming a little bit freer, then some very good memorial books were prepared, and as many as 5,000 or 8,000 names were sort of carefully compiled, mainly from the stories of relatives, who would then inform the people collecting the stories and then try to get the names right. We've now got access to the archives, the Soviet archives in Kiev, with the post-war dates of birth, and a much larger list of victims has been created. But I have to say that also includes non-Jewish victims, and it may include some duplicates. It's always hard to sort of compile these lists without some duplications. So although that sounds like a large proportion of the 33,000 victims, if you realize that as many as 60 or 70,000 people may have been killed in or near Babyn Yar, and many of them were not Jewish, then the number of Jewish victims may still not be more than about 10,000 that we can actually name. And another problem is that many people who lived in Kiev died in other places in Europe during the war. So we may never know exactly who was killed in Babyn Yar and who was killed elsewhere. Often sometimes it's even hard to find the people that survived and the people who died. So you have to translate names and dates of birth from people living in the USA or Australia and sort of eliminate them from the possible victims, because they did actually survive one way or another. So it's never going to be possible to have a perfect list, but we do have many more names than even just a few years ago.
Okay. Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you very much that you spoke about your recent work today to us and to this great public today. I would like to announce that our next Behind Memory session will be held on October 28th by Kai Struve on anti-Jewish pogroms in Western Ukraine in the year 1941. And you're all invited to join the next Behind Memory session. We will send you by mail or on our social media the further information to this event. So at this point, once again, thank you very much, Martin, Dean, for your great presentation.
You're most welcome, and it's been an honor to commemorate on this sacred day today. Thank you.
Okay. So goodbye and good evening to everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.